You have been lied to. For decades, cinema has sold you a fantasy. They told you the story of a general who became a slave, a gladiator who defied an emperor in the arena. It is a beautiful story, it stirs the blood, but it is a fiction. The truth is infinitely more brutal. The truth is buried under 6 feet of snow and soaked in the blood of 10,000 warriors in a forgotten valley called Azali. The man you know as Maximus did not fight for the applause of a crowd. He fought to stop the apocalypse. And his greatest victory wasn't in the Colosseum. It happened in the dead of winter, in the year 167 AD, when the Roman Empire was on its knees, bleeding out and staring into the abyss of extinction. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Below you lies a carnage so absolute, so devastating that the mind struggles to comprehend it. 10,000 bodies, the elite warriors of the Marcomanni tribes, the most terrifying force the North had ever produced, lying dead in the snow. They were not defeated in a fair fight. They were slaughtered, and standing over them were just 3,000 Roman soldiers. How does a force outnumbered 3-1, starving, freezing, and terrified, annihilate an invincible enemy in a single night? This is not a story of a miracle. It is a story of a trap. A gamble so insane, so reckless, that only one man in the history of Rome had the nerve to execute it. This is how the Real Gladiator, Marco Nonio Macrino, saved the world. To understand the nightmare of Azali, you have to understand the smell of the air in 167 AD, smelled of rotting flesh and wood smoke. The Roman Empire. The superpower that had ruled the world for centuries was dying. It wasn't a slow decline, it was a cliff edge. A plague brought back from the east had liquefied the lungs of millions. Cities were empty. The legions, once the pride of the world, were hollow shells, filled with sick, coughing boys who had never held a sword. And watching this giant stumble were the wolves. The Germanic tribes across the Danube River. For centuries they had been divided, fighting each other. But now they smelled the weakness. They had united under a king named Balamar. They weren't coming to raid, they were coming to exterminate. The border had collapsed. The barbarians were on Italian soil. Panic was the only currency left in Rome. In this chaos, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius turned to the only man he could trust. Not a politician, not a prince, but a man of pure cold logic, Macrino. But even Macrino, with all his brilliance, seemed helpless when the news arrived. It came on a horse covered in freezing foam, ridden by a scout who looked more corpse than human. He collapsed in the command tent, gasping out a message that froze the blood of every general in the room. The outpost at Azali was under siege. Azali wasn't just a fort, it was the keyhole to the mountain pass, and inside, trapped behind shattering wooden gates, were 500 Roman soldiers. Outside those gates, 10,000 Marcomanni warriors. Led by the wildest of Balamar's lieutenants, they had surrounded the fort like a rising black tide. The math was simple. It was brutal. 500 men against 10,000, the eagles against the wolves. The commander of the fort, a veteran named Tullus, had sent a final message. He swore to hold until the last man. He swore to make them pay for every inch of wood and stone. But he knew, and Macrino knew, that they wouldn't last until the next moon. The command tent went silent. You could hear the wind howling outside, the sound of winter trying to kill them all. The other generals, men with noble names and soft hands, looked at the map. They did the math, and they did what terrified men always do. They hid behind logic. One by one they spoke. Their voices were reasonable. They were calm. They were cowardly. "It is a bait," one said. "Look at the map, Macrino. Balamar wants us to move. He wants us to march our main army into that pass to save those 500 men, and when we do, he will collapse on us from the ridges. He will ambush the entire army. We will lose everything." Another general nodded, his face pale in the candlelight. "Azali is lost. Those men are already dead. It is a tragedy, yes, but we must think of Rome. We must think of the empire. We sacrifice the pawn to save the king. It is the only logical move. We stay here. We fortify. We let them die." It made sense. It was the standard military doctrine. When an enemy sets a trap, you do not walk into it. You let the bait be taken. You let 500 men scream in the dark as they are butchered, so that you can live to fight another day. The generals looked at Macrino, waiting for him to nod, waiting for him to give the order to abandon their brothers. They expected him to be reasonable. They expected him to be a Roman aristocrat who viewed soldiers as numbers on a ledger. But they didn't understand who was standing at the head of the table. They were looking at a politician. They didn't realize they were in the room with a predator. Macrino stared at the map. He saw the trap. He saw the logic. But he also saw something else. He saw the eyes of his own soldiers outside the tent. This army he was leading was fragile. They were survivors of the plague. They were terrified. They believed the barbarians were invincible monsters. If he let 500 of their brothers die alone in the dark while the main army sat safe in their tents, the spirit of his legions would break. The fear would return. They would realize that their general viewed them as disposable meat. And an army that does not trust its leader is already defeated. He knew that the true trap wasn't in the mountains. The true trap was in the mind. If he followed the logic of his generals, he would save the army's bodies, but he would kill its soul. And without a soul, Rome would fall. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Macrino finally looked up from the map. His voice was quiet. It didn't boom like a theatre actor. It cut through the air like a scalpel. "We do not sacrifice anyone," he said. The generals blinked. They started to protest to explain the suicide of it all. But the ambush, the numbers, it's impossible. Macrino silenced them with a look. "We will not march into their ambush," he whispered. "We will do what they do not expect. We will do what they believe is impossible." He pointed a finger at the map, not at the main road, not at the valley floor where the enemy waited. He pointed to the black, blank spaces on the map, the deep forests, the frozen swamps, the jagged ridges where no army could march, the hunting grounds of the wolves. "We are not going to rescue them," Macrino said, a cold fire burning in his eyes. "We are going to hunt the hunters. I will not take the whole army. I will take only the best, the hardest, 3,000 men. We will move through the dark. We will move through the hell of the forest. And we will fall upon their backs before they even know we are there." The generals were horrified. It was madness. An 80-kilometer march in 36 hours through impenetrable terrain in the middle of winter couldn't be done. It was a death sentence. Macrino didn't listen. He walked out of the tent and into the freezing night. He didn't look for the officers. He looked for the veterans, the men with scarred faces and cold eyes. He was about to ask them to do the impossible. He was about to ask them to walk into the jaws of death, not for gold, not for Rome, but for the 500 men dying in Azali. The gamble had begun, and the price of failure was the end of the world. The camp was silent, but it wasn't the silence of sleep. It was the silence of men preparing to walk into their own graves. Macrino moved through the lines, handpicking his force. He didn't want the loudest men or the biggest men. He wanted the survivors. He chose 2 cohorts of legionaries, men who had already stared death in the face and blinked first. He added the Gallic auxiliary cavalry, riders who knew how to move through forests like smoke. 3,000 men. That was it. 3,000 against a horde of 10,000 waiting in the mountains. The orders were simple and terrifying. No fires, no talking, no stopping. They had to cover 80 kilometers of treacherous frozen wilderness in 36 hours. If they were late by even an hour, the fort at Azali would be a smoking ruin, and their march would be for nothing. If they were spotted by a single barbarian scout, the alarm would be raised, and they would be slaughtered in the narrow valleys before they even saw the enemy. This wasn't a military maneuver, it was a ghost story in the making. They moved out under the cover of a moonless sky. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on their armor. This wasn't the organized marching of a parade in Rome, this was a scramble through hell. They waded through freezing swamps where the ice broke under their sandals, cutting their skin. They climbed ridges so steep they had to drag each other up by their belts. The wind howled through the black trees, biting into their bones, whispering that it would be easier to just lie down in the snow and sleep forever. Hunger began to gnaw at their stomachs. Their legs burned with lactic acid. The equipment, 40 pounds of armor, weapons and shields, felt like it weighed a ton. In any other army under any other general, mutiny would have started after the first 12 hours. Men would have collapsed. They would have refused to take another step. But this army kept moving. Not because of the whip of a centurion, but because of what they saw at the front of the column. Macrino wasn't riding a white horse in the rear, surrounded by bodyguards and warmth. He was at the vanguard. He was on foot. His boots were soaked in the same freezing mud as the lowest private. He carried his own weight. He shivered in the same wind. When a wagon wheel broke, he was the one pushing it out of the muck. When a soldier stumbled, It was the general's hand that pulled him up. For the Roman soldier, this was something they had never seen. Aristocrats led from the back, they treated soldiers like cattle, but Macrino was showing them that their lives had value. He was suffering with them. And in the freezing dark of the Germanic forest, a bond was forged that was stronger than iron. It wasn't discipline that kept them moving, it was hell. They weren't marching for the Empire anymore, they were marching for him. They realized that if this man was willing to walk into hell on foot, then they would follow him until their hearts exploded. While Macrino's ghosts raced against time, time was running out at Azali. The fort was a scene from the end of the world. For 2 days, the 500 men under the veteran Tullus had held back the tide. But the tide was rising. The Marcomanni knew no help was coming. They knew the Romans were abandoned. And that confidence made them reckless. They didn't probe the defences, they threw themselves at the walls in waves of screaming fury. The scene inside the fort was a nightmare. The ground was slick with blood. Arrows rained down in clouds, blacking out the grey sky. The shouts of the dying mixed with the rhythmic thud-thud-thuds of the battering rams against the main gate. The wood was splintering. The iron hinges were groaning, twisting under the assault. Tullus looked at his men. They were exhausted, wounded, propped up against the walls. They had no water. They had no hope. But they had their honour. They tightened their grip on their gladius handles. They weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting for a good death. They wanted to take as many of the wolves with them as they could. "Hold!" Tullus screamed, his voice cracking over the roar of the battle. "Hold for 1 more hour! Make them pay for this ground!" But the enemy was endless. Outside the walls, the Marcomanni were drunk on the promise of victory. Their fires lit up the valley floor, a sea of torches and eager faces. They could smell the fear inside the fort. They surged forward for the final assault. The battering ram swung back one last time. It smashed into the gates with a crack that sounded like thunder. The timber gave way. The gates burst open. A roar went up from 10,000 throats. The wolves poured toward the breach. The 500 Romans inside braced themselves for the end. This was it. The slaughter was about to begin. But miles away, on the high ridge overlooking the valley, the impossible happened. Macrino's force arrived. They were gasping for air, their lungs burning, their bodies pushed beyond the limit of human endurance. They had marched for 36 hours without sleep. They were shadows of men. But as they looked down into the valley, the exhaustion vanished. They saw the fires. They saw the vast, chaotic camp of the enemy, and they saw the Marcomanni swarming toward the fort, their backs completely turned to the forest. The enemy was blind. They were deaf. They were so focused on the kill in front of them that they had forgotten to watch the dark behind them. Macrino stood on the edge of the tree line. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He looked at his cavalry commander. He looked at his infantry. He raised his hand slowly. The silence on the ridge was absolute. Below them, 10,000 barbarians were screaming for blood. Above them, 3,000 Romans drew their swords in unison, without making a sound. The trap was set. The predator had become the prey. Macrino dropped his hand, and with a single, sharp motion he unleashed hell. The sound that tore through the frozen air wasn't a scream. It was the brazen, terrifying blast of a Roman cornu. To the Marcomanni warriors storming the gates of the fort, it was a sound that didn't belong in their world. They froze. For a split second, the battle stopped. Heads turned, eyes widened, and then the ground began to shake. From the darkness of the tree line, the Gallic cavalry exploded into the valley floor like a landslide. They didn't scream, they thundered. Before the barbarian rearguard could even lift their shields, the riders were upon them. Lances punched through leather and bone, swords slashed through tent ropes, collapsing heavy canvas onto sleeping men. Torches were thrown into the chaos, and within moments the rear of the barbarian camp was an inferno. Panic is a poison, and Macrino knew exactly how to inject it. The Marcomanni at the front, the ones smashing against the fort gates, turned around to see their world burning. Their brains couldn't process the nightmare. Where had they come from? How many were there? Was this the entire Roman army? The doubt was deadlier than any sword. They hesitated, and in war, hesitation is death. While the cavalry sowed chaos, the true horror emerged from the shadows behind them. The Roman infantry, Macrino's chosen men, they didn't run like a mob, they advanced like a machine, step by step, shield by shield, a wall of iron moving in perfect, terrifying silence. The barbarians, disoriented and terrified, tried to counterattack. They threw themselves at the Roman line in wild, screaming charges, but they crashed against the scooter shields like water breaking against a cliff. This was the clash of two worlds, the wild, individual fury of the Germanic tribes against the cold, mathematical violence of Rome. And logic was winning. The legionaries stabbed with short, efficient thrusts. Step, stab, kill. Step, stab, kill. They moved as a single organism. They didn't fight with anger. They fought with the efficiency of butchers clearing a slaughterhouse. Inside the fort, the sound of the Roman horns changed everything. For the 500 doomed men under Tullus, it wasn't a signal of attack. It was the sound of resurrection. The despair vanished instantly, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it felt like magic. They didn't need orders. They knew what was happening. The 10th had arrived. The general was here. The shattered gates of the fort, which had been their tomb, suddenly became the jaws of a trap. Tullus rallied his broken men. They roared, a sound of pure defiance, and charged out of the fort. The trap snapped shut. It was the classic hammer and anvil executed to perfection in the middle of a burning nightmare. The Marcomanni were crushed. To their front, the relentless wall of Macrino's legionaries pushed them back. To their rear, the resurrected garrison of Tullus hacked into them with suicidal fury. And on their flanks, the cavalry appeared and disappeared through the smoke like ghosts, cutting down anyone who tried to run. The valley of Azali became a killbox. The barbarians were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their axes. They were pressed against each other, screaming, crushed between two walls of Roman steel. From the high ground, Macrino watched. He didn't see the blood or the gore. He saw the flow of the battle. He saw the geometry of death. He saw the exact moment the enemy's spirit broke. He saw their left flank waver, the warriors dropping their weapons to flee. A lesser commander might have let them go, satisfied with the victory. But Macrino wasn't there to win a battle. He was there to send a message. He signalled his cavalry. The order was simple, 2 words that sealed the fate of thousands: start hunting. The retreat became a massacre. The Romans didn't just defeat the enemy, they erased them. They chased them down through the snow, through the burning tents, into the frozen swamps. There was no mercy. There were no prisoners. This was extermination. By the time the sun rose over the mountains, a heavy, thick silence had fallen over Azali. The only sound was the crackle of dying fires and the groans of the wounded. The valley floor was a carpet of bodies. 10,000 warriors, the pride of the Marcomanni nation, lay dead, their faces frozen in expressions of shock. Macrino walked through the carnage. His boots crunched on the blood-soaked snow. He approached the ruined gate of the fort. Tullus limped out to meet him. The veteran was covered in blood, exhausted, barely standing. He looked at Macrino, the aristocrat who had marched through hell to save him. He didn't bow, he didn't cheer, he simply nodded. It was the silent respect of one warrior to another. They both knew what had just happened. They had achieved the impossible. But as Macrino looked out over the field of the dead, he felt no joy. He knew something the cheering soldiers didn't. This victory, as crushing as it was, wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He hadn't just defeated a raiding party, he had kicked a hornet's nest. News of this massacre would travel. It would drift through the dark forest like a virus, all the way to the throne of King Balamar. The king wouldn't be scared. He would be enraged. Macrino had just declared total war on a scale the frontier had never seen. The Marcomanni wouldn't come back with a raiding party next time. They wouldn't come for plunder. They would come for revenge. Macrino looked north into the grey mist of Germania. He knew what was coming. The real storm was just gathering. And to survive it, he would have to do something far worse than slaughter 10,000 men. He would have to burn his own empire to the ground. The massacre at Azali was not the end of the war. It was the spark that ignited the inferno. The news of the slaughter didn't just stay in the valley. It travelled. It moved through the frozen forests like a dark wind, carried by terrified survivors, until it reached the ears of the one man Rome should have feared most: King Balamar. Balamar was not a mindless savage. He was a visionary who had done the impossible. He had united the tribes. When he heard that 10,000 of his best warriors had been erased in a single night, he didn't fly into a blind rage. He sat on his throne and he understood the truth. This was not a lucky skirmish. This was a declaration. He realized that the Roman general across the river was not like the incompetent aristocrats he had fought before. This new enemy used speed as a weapon and deception as a shield. Balamar felt something he hadn't felt in years: respect. The respect of one predator for another. He knew he couldn't defeat this ghost general, Macrino, with skirmishes. He had to crush him under a tidal wave of steel. As Balamar played his ultimate card, he summoned the Great Horde. The scouts Macrino sent north returned with faces white as ash. Their reports were terrifying. It wasn't an army marching toward the Danube. It was a migration, a nation on the move. Over 200,000 warriors were coming. Behind them were their families, their cattle, their entire world. They had burned their own villages behind them. They weren't coming to raid and leave. They were coming to conquer and stay. It was victory or extinction. Macrino stood in his command tent, looking at the numbers. The math was a death sentence. He had 30,000 men. The enemy had 200,000. If he met them in open battle, his legions would be swallowed whole. If he hid behind the walls of his forts, the horde would simply bypass them, surround them, and starve them out. The tactics of Azali, the quick strikes, the ambushes, were useless against a force this size. He needed a new plan. A plan so radical, so dangerous, and so cowardly on the surface that his own officers thought he had lost his mind. He gave the order, "Retreat!" The shock in the camp was absolute. They had just won a glorious victory. They were heroes, and now their general was ordering them to run, to abandon the forts they had bled to protect. Macrino was firm. They would not just retreat. They would cede territory. They would give the enemy exactly what they wanted, the land itself. But Macrino was not giving them a gift. He was giving them a curse. As the Roman army pulled back, they didn't just leave, they destroyed. They burned the crops, they poisoned the wells, they evacuated every village and city, leaving nothing behind but ash and sequence. It was a strategy of defense in depth pushed to its most brutal extreme. Macrino wrote to the emperor, "If they want this province, we will give it to them, and we will make every step they take a swallow of poison." For the Roman soldiers, it was torture. Every day they marched south, turning their backs on the enemy, listening to the taunts of the barbarian horns following them. Their discipline was stretched to the breaking point. They felt like cowards. They asked, "Why are we running? Why are we burning our own homes?" They didn't see the chessboard. They didn't see that Macrino was trading space for time. For Balamar and the Horde, the invasion began as a celebration. They crossed the river and found the forts empty. They laughed at the Roman cowards. They marched deeper into the empire, feeling invincible. But slowly the celebration turned to ashes in their mouths. The land was dead. There was no food to scavenge. The water made them sick. The cattle they brought with them began to die because there was no grass to graze on the scorched earth. Every mile they marched into Roman territory didn't make them stronger. It made them weaker. The empire wasn't fighting them, it was digesting them. This was Macrino's genius. He wasn't attacking the warriors. He was attacking their families. A warrior can march on an empty stomach for glory, but he cannot ignore the crying of his starving child. Hunger became Macrino's invisible legion. Desperate, Balamar tried to force a fight. He launched lightning attacks, trying to pin the Romans down. But Macrino's rearguard was like a phantom. They would absorb the blow, inflict heavy casualties, and then vanish again into the south, drawing the horde deeper and deeper into the trap. For 2 months the chase continued. A game of cat and mouse played across an entire continent. The horde was starving, angry, and exhausted. They were stretched thin, and finally the scouts brought Macrino the news he had been waiting for. They had reached the kill zone. It wasn't a fortress. It was a valley near the city of Aquileia. A geographical cage. It was wide enough for the horde to enter, but the sides were steep cliffs, and a river cut across the exit. It was a place where numbers wouldn't matter. It was the end of the chessboard. Macrino rode to the front of his tired, grumbling army. He looked at the valley. He looked at his men, and he gave the order that changed everything. Halt. Turn around. Dig. The confusion in the ranks vanished, replaced by an electric realization. They hadn't been running. They had been leading the wolf to the slaughterhouse. The suffering, the shame, the retreat, it all had a purpose. The legions began to dig. They built trenches, they sharpened stakes, they turned the valley floor into a machine of death. The dog that had been running had finally turned around, and now it was baring its fangs. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. The horde, desperate and starving, was rushing toward them. The final collision was hours away. The future of Rome would not be decided by politicians in the Senate, but here, in the mud, by the men of the legions. There was no more retreat. There was no tomorrow. The hunter became the hunted one last time. The valley of Aquileia was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath before a scream. On one side stood the great horde, 200,000 strong, a sea of desperate humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. On the other side stood the legions of Macrino, entrenched behind a wall of earth and wood, standing in the mud they had dug with their own hands. This was the final wall. If it broke, Rome would burn. King Balamar rode before his starving warriors. He didn't speak of strategy, he spoke to their hunger. He pointed his sword at the Roman defences. "Look at them!" he roared. "Behind that wall is food, behind that wall is land, behind that wall is the life they stole from you." He promised them paradise, and in return he asked for their rage. A roar went up from 200,000 throats, a sound so loud it shook the snow from the trees. It was the sound of hunger about to be unleashed. On the Roman side there were no speeches about gods or glory. Macrino walked the line, his voice calm, cutting through the freezing air. "They are not soldiers," he told his men. "They are a mob. They are desperate. You are the legion." He told them to trust the steel in their hands and the man standing next to them. When he finished, there was no cheering. There was only the terrifying rhythmic sound of thousands of gladius swords hitting shields in unison. Thud, thud, thud. A heartbeat of war. Then the dam broke. The horde charged. It was like watching a landslide of flesh and iron. But Macrino's mind had already fought this battle 1,000 times. As the first wave of barbarians rushed forward, the ground beneath them gave way. Thousands fell screaming into hidden pits filled with sharpened stakes. The charge shattered. The momentum broke. The sheer mass of the horde pushed the front ranks forward, forcing them onto the Roman spears. The battle at the wall was a meat grinder. It was a brutal, claustrophobic struggle for every inch of dirt. For hours the barbarians threw themselves at the defences, climbing over the bodies of their own dead to reach the Romans. And for hours the wall held. Macrino's logic was holding back the chaos, but the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. The Romans were tiring. The line was bending. Balamar, watching from the rear, saw the weakness. He saw the Roman line thinning. He sensed victory. He prepared to commit his final reserves to break the deadlock. But Macrino had one card left to play. He looked toward the hills flanking the valley. He gave the signal, and suddenly the trap snapped shut completely. 2 fresh Roman detachments, hidden in the dense tree line for days, charged down the slopes. They didn't hit the barbarian front. They crashed into their exposed flanks and rear. Panic, the oldest enemy of any army, took hold. The horde was no longer attacking. They were being squeezed. Surrounded on 3 sides, pressed against the river and the Roman wall, the army ceased to be a fighting force and became a trapped animal. In the centre of the collapse, Balamar realised it was over. He saw his dream of a new empire turning into a slaughterhouse. He made a final desperate choice. He wouldn't run. He locked his eyes on the Roman standards at the centre of the line. He saw Macrino. With a roar of defiance, the barbarian king charged, leading his elite guard in a suicidal wedge, trying to cut the head off the Roman snake. He broke through the first line. He broke through the second. But he couldn't break the logic of Rome. He crashed into the wall of the Praetorian Guard. The fight was savage, brief and final. Balamar, the man who had united the tribes and threatened to extinguish civilization, fell at the feet of his enemy. He was pierced by a dozen disciplined spears, dying not in a duel of glory, but in a chaotic scrum of steel. With their king dead, the horde disintegrated. The threat was destroyed. Rome was safe. Macrino did not stand over the body and scream in triumph. He simply wiped his blade. He had done his job. He was welcomed back to Rome not as a gladiator, but as a saviour. Emperor Marcus Aurelius heaped honours upon him, and they remained close friends until the emperor's last breath. But time is a thief. Over the centuries, the name Marco Nonio Macrino faded. Hollywood dug up his bones and turned him into a fiction. They gave us Maximus, a hero driven by the murder of his family, fighting for personal revenge in the arena. It's a great story. We love it because it's simple. But the true story is more important. The real man wasn't driven by vengeance, he was driven by duty. He was a man who understood that sometimes to save the light, You have to do terrible things in the dark. He didn't save the world with a sword in a coliseum. He saved it with a map, a shovel, and a mind that refused to break. His story wasn't a personal tragedy. It was the brutal, inglorious triumph of order over chaos. He wasn't the hero the movies invented. He was the hero that history in its darkest hour desperately needed.